A horrific tale of neglect, the tragic story of Lacey Fletcher. Have you ever wondered what horrific secrets might be hiding behind the closed doors of neighboring houses? Families that appear perfect at first glance can be immersed in dark depths where terrible stories capable of shocking even the strongest individuals are kept. In 2022, such a tragedy unfolded in the small town of Slaughter, Louisiana. This was a story that outraged not just local residents, but an entire state and shocked the national community. The story of Lacey Fletcher, a girl whose tragic death forced society to contemplate indifference, family relationships, and responsibility towards the closest people. On the night of January 3, 2022, Sheila Fletcher called 911. She reported that her daughter was not breathing. When police and medical personnel arrived at the scene, they were shocked by what they saw. Lacey's body, lying on the couch, had become part of the furniture, her skin so deeply fused with the upholstery after years of immobility. This was more than just a case of incompetence or cruelty, this was a system where indifference had become the norm and suffering had been ignored for years. What medical personnel discovered on site was the greatest shock. According to Coroner Yul Bickham, this was the worst case of his career. Lacey, who had a severe form of autism, was forced to spend most of her life on the couch, and her physical condition indicated that she had probably remained motionless on it for over 10 years. She died slowly and painfully over the last 12 years. Her skin was covered with deep bedsores, and her muscles were almost completely atrophied. Her weight did not exceed 38 kilograms. This was not just a consequence of neglect, this was a cruel isolation that had lasted for decades. Lacey's body lay on the couch, but it wasn't just lying there, it had literally become part of the furniture. Her skin had fused with the upholstery due to years of immobility. She was naked, except for a small blue t-shirt that barely covered her chest. Her eyes were wide open, with a clouded and alienated gaze. Her crossed legs were deeply sunken into the soft couch upholstery, which was covered with a layer of excrement. As a result, the severe ulcers on her body, especially on the lower part, looked as if they had rotted down to the bone. Her face was framed by large red patches. Feces were smeared all over her body, even getting into her hair and ears. Larvae crawled across her entire body, leaving trails, and numerous insect bites only intensified her suffering. In some areas, the skin had disappeared. In other areas of her back and buttocks, the body had become so black that it was difficult to understand that this had recently been a living person. At the same time, the entire house seemed well maintained and perfect, except for this horrific pre-death scene. Nearby stood well-kept furniture, a neat dresser with folded clothes, bottles of lotion, and wet wipes. All of this created a bizarre contrast with the horrific conditions in which Lacey was kept. The smell in the room was so unbearable that some specialists could not perform their duties. Coroner Yul Bickham later admitted that this case was the worst in his entire career. He said that Lacey died very painfully and for a long time. According to the coroner's report, the condition of Lacey's body indicated that she had been in an immobile position on the couch for over 10 years. Her skin was covered with deep bedsores, and her muscles had practically atrophied. Yul Bickham, the coroner, stated, "I have worked with hundreds of cases, but I have never seen anything like this. This was not just indifference. It looked like a slow and systematic deprivation of life." Another crucial aspect was the horrific condition of Lacey's organs due to years of malnutrition. Her weight was only around 38 kilograms. It was like a scene from a horror movie, but this was reality, said one of the jurors who later shared her impressions of what she had seen. One of the most striking facts was that the rest of the Fletcher house looked well maintained. While Lacey lived in terrible conditions, other rooms appeared clean and tidy. Expensive appliances stood in the kitchen, and the living room was decorated with religious symbols. The family's defenders tried to explain the parents' behavior as stress and exhaustion. However, many experts working on the case pointed out that the Fletchers had choices but consciously did not use any opportunity to help their daughter. To understand how this could happen, it's worth looking at the Fletcher family from another perspective. In 1995, this family settled in Slaughter. Sheila and Clay Fletcher were typical middle-class representatives. They were active community members. Sheila even held various positions in the city administration, and Clay worked for a charitable organization. Their daughter, Lacey, was adored by neighbors as a bright, smiling child. In the early years, she was able to socialize and communicate normally with other people. Many teachers spoke of Lacey as an intelligent and diligent girl. A friend of the girl who was friends with her in 9th grade recalled her as a friendly person. However, over time, the situation began to change. Lacey, who had been diagnosed with autism from the beginning, began to face serious problems in her teenage years, particularly with social anxiety. When she was 14, she was transferred to homeschooling due to increased anxiety, and her communication with other people significantly decreased. This was the first signal that something was wrong with the girl. But even then, when Lacey was distancing herself from the world, her parents seemed to pay no attention. Lacey attended a psychologist for 3 years. But because Lacey refused hospitalization, her parents did not insist on it. The parents even considered obtaining a court order to place their daughter in a medical facility. She began to distance herself from her peers and dramatically differ from children her age. Lacey's friend, the neighbor's son Robert Ablates, said, "She became different. She just looked at things differently from many other children. She was different from other children her age. I knew she was an atypical teenager." He also mentioned that Lacey was truly a very intelligent person. But she was not mature like others. She was interested in childish things, not teenage ones. She was already 18 but still watched Disney cartoons. According to neighbors' accounts, even at 20, Lacey could still be seen on the street, but later she completely disappeared from view. Her parents explained this by saying that Lacey simply did not like communicating with people. However, her absence became increasingly obvious. All neighbors considered her just a shy girl who did not like going out in public. Behind the closed doors of the Fletcher house, a terrible tragedy was unfolding. Lacey, given her illness, needed constant help and attention. However, instead of seeking help or support from society, her parents locked her within 4 walls. They never let social workers in, even refusing assistance. "Lacey just doesn't like strangers," Sheila would respond when social services tried to understand how her daughter was doing. "We thought she was just shy," one neighbor confessed. Her parents always said Lacey was fine, that she just didn't like communicating with people. It seemed plausible, and I didn't insist. During the investigation, police found old photographs of Lacey, where she was with friends, at family events. In these images, she looked happy. But the more they searched, the more they discovered pictures where she was clearly emaciated and neglected. This raised new questions. Why did the parents continue to document their daughter's condition but not seek help? Lacey Fletcher, a girl who became a victim of abuse and neglect by her parents, died in 2022, and her story shocked even the harshest critics of social services and law enforcement. Lacey's parents, Sheila and Clay Fletcher, were charged with their child's death due to intentional disregard for her health and refusal to provide medical care. All these events became known only after her death, when the investigation began. But the facts revealed during the investigation provoked incredible outrage. Lacey had a chance to survive if her parents had sought medical help. She was suffering from severe malnutrition and dehydration, which was evident days before her death. Instead, her parents refused to recognize the seriousness of the situation, and ultimately, this cost her life, was found in the court investigation documents. Lacey was found dead in her room, lying on the floor. Her body was exhausted to the limit, without any strength for even elementary movement. Her weight was critically low, almost 50% less than normal. Her skin was pale and wrinkled due to complete dehydration. This moment was shocking for detectives, as they could not believe a child had been left without help for so long. During the investigation, they established that the girl had not visited a doctor for 16 years, last being at a medical appointment at the age of 20. When we found Lacey, her condition was incredibly serious. We could not understand why she was not being fed. She was completely exhausted, her body could no longer withstand such conditions. This was not an accident. This was conscious neglect, was mentioned in the police detective's interrogation. One of the most shocking moments that caused general public outrage was how Lacey's parents reacted to her condition. Clay and Sheila, instead of helping their daughter, ignored her calls for help, even when her body had already begun showing critical signs of exhaustion. They continued to hide the problem from those around them and did not report their child's condition to doctors or social services. During interrogation, Sheila Fletcher stated, "I did not see serious health problems in Lacey. She was just very picky about food. Sometimes children don't want to eat, and we thought it was just her choice." This statement raises even more questions about parental irresponsibility. At a time when Lacey was clearly unable to even move, her parents paid no attention to her pain and suffering. During the interrogation, the parents emphasized that their daughter was conscious and had chosen this lifestyle herself. Lacey was intellectually sound until her final days, so her parents claimed they could not force her to do anything against her will. They said they cared for her as best they could, bringing food to the couch, cleaning up urine and feces, and treating bedsores. However, she never said anything hurt her and did not want to visit doctors, and moreover, did not even want to move. The mother indicated that Lacey was still alive at 10 p.m., although the investigation established that the girl had been dead for more than a day. But the mother insisted otherwise. After the tragedy became known, an investigation began that revealed even more horrifying facts. For a long time, Lacey was completely isolated from the outside world. Social services had no data about her physical condition, as the parents did not visit doctors and even refused visits from social workers. This highlights serious gaps in the child protection system. First, Lacey was cut off from the outside world, having no contact with peers or other people. Second, her mother and father tried to hide her condition from relatives and neighbors, preventing anyone from seeing her. Third, when the police began investigating, it was discovered that the parents had been concealing child abuse for an extended period. Lacey's neighbors, who later became witnesses in court, recalled hearing the girl's screams through the thin walls of the house. However, they did not dare to intervene. One neighbor who testified during the trial said, "I heard her screams and crying, sometimes even loud sobs, but I always thought it was just family problems. We never really know what happens behind closed doors, so I didn't pay attention. Now I regret not helping." After the shocking discovery became public, local residents began to recall strange moments that previously did not seem important. Sarah McGee, Sheila's neighbor, remembered feeling an unpleasant smell coming from the Fletchers' home for many years. "I asked Sheila about it, and she explained they had plumbing issues. It seemed plausible, and I didn't insist," she reported. Local journalists discovered that, despite numerous requests from social services, the Fletcher family refused to let them into their house. This sparked outrage in the community. "If we had only known, we could have helped," the neighbors said. The lawyers for Clay and Sheila Fletcher attempted to explain the parents' behavior as a result of emotional exhaustion and depression. They argued that the couple was trapped in their fears and could not understand the full seriousness of the situation. They loved their daughter but could not break out of this closed circle, the lawyers stated. However, the community was outraged by such arguments, as no one could understand how one could leave a child without medical assistance in such a critical condition. The consequences of this tragedy are still felt today. The local community cannot recover from the shock, as this was a family everyone considered exemplary. After the story became public, a memorial was established in memory of Lacey. It became a symbol of the tragedy caused by indifference and cruelty. The legal proceedings continue, but even after the initial condemnation of Sheila and Clay Fletcher, many people still had numerous questions. How could they have allowed such a situation? Why did society fail to notice for so long that something was wrong with this family? And most importantly, why wasn't more done to help Lacey while she was still alive? Lacey Fletcher's tragedy raised countless ethical and moral questions for society. How could someone be left without proper assistance for so long when it was obvious that their physical condition was critical? To what extent are we responsible for those living near us, even if their lives seem distant and unremarkable to us? Shouldn't we respond to any warning signals, even if they seem insignificant or not our business? One of the key questions was, does society have the right to intervene in people's private lives, especially when it comes to families with children with special needs? Throughout the investigation, many people drew attention to the importance of ensuring a balance between the right to privacy and the necessity of providing assistance in situations where there is a real threat to health or life. How should we react to a tragedy of such magnitude? Selective ignorance or lack of appropriate response regarding families with problematic children can lead to such horrific consequences. At a certain point, this became a question about the overall moral condition of our society. We can all make room for others to help, but this requires a strong will and responsibility that not everyone is prepared to take on. Lacey Fletcher became a symbol of a forgotten victim who was left alone with her own problems due to the indifference of those around her. Her death moved an entire country, as this case became a loud reminder of how important it is to act and the first signs appear that someone among us might be in danger. Sheila and Clay Fletcher were charged with improper care of their daughter, which led to her death. The prosecution emphasized that they not only failed to provide necessary medical assistance but also did not seek professional help. Evidence that Lacey had not moved for years and was in a critical physical condition indicated prolonged and systematic neglect. Sheila and Clay Fletcher were also accused of attempting to conceal the real situation, and even if they did not intend to kill their daughter, their inaction caused her death. The trial was covered in the media and caused a significant public resonance, as the issue of parental responsibility for their children and the duty to protect their health and life became the main topic of discussion. County Judge Catherine Jones made a decision to drop the murder charges against Lacey Fletcher's parents. The primary reason for this was an error in the wording of the indictment, which the defense drew attention to. Subsequently, Clay and Sheila Fletcher were released on bail, with the amount being $300,000 for each. This decision was made shortly before the planned trial scheduled for June 2023. Despite the initial charges being dropped, prosecutor Sam D'Aquila stated his intention to submit the case for reconsideration to another grand jury. Through this, the possibility of holding the Fletchers accountable remains, and they may still receive the punishment they deserve. Despite the entire tragedy, Lacey Fletcher's story became a powerful catalyst for change. In Louisiana, new measures were introduced to prevent similar incidents in the future. Proposed changes to social service laws would provide them with more opportunities to help children at risk of abuse or neglect at an earlier stage. Many people became more attentive to children and individuals with special needs in their communities. A memorial was created in Lacey's honor, where local residents gather each year to commemorate her memory and remind themselves of the importance of being responsible for the lives of those who need help. The local community realized that even if someone appears isolated or inactive, it does not mean they do not require support. They learn to be more empathetic, to pay attention to people around them, especially when the first signs appear that they might be in a difficult situation. Lacey Fletcher's story is a tragic lesson for all of us. It is a reminder of how important it is to act when we see that something irreparable is happening to someone close to us or our neighbors. We have no right to remain indifferent to others' suffering. Sometimes, even the smallest step we take to help another person can save a life. Lacey could not escape the horror unfolding in her life, but her story became a call for all of us not to allow similar tragedies to repeat themselves. Society must learn to be attentive and compassionate toward those who cannot independently seek help. Ultimately, we all bear responsibility for one another, and it is our duty to ensure safety, support, and respect for every individual. Sylvia Likens emerged from a family defined by persistent mobility and economic uncertainty. Born to Lester and Betty Likens, she occupied the middle ground between two sets of twins, Diana and Daniel, 2 years her senior, and Jenny and Benny, 1 year her junior. Her younger sister Jenny, afflicted by polio, received Sylvia's unwavering, tender care. Those acquainted with Sylvia remembered her as a vibrant child, characterized by an infectious sense of humor. Like many adolescent girls of her era, she harbored a passionate fascination with the Beatles, frequently expressing her musical enthusiasm through spontaneous singing. Upon her initial arrival at the Banaszewski household, she even participated in the family's amateur musical performances. The Likens family's domestic landscape was marked by profound instability. Lester and Betty's relationship perpetually oscillated between separation and reconciliation, creating a turbulent environment for their children. As seasonal workers, the parents navigated a nomadic existence, constantly traversing the country in pursuit of sporadic employment. Chronic financial scarcity defined their lifestyle. Even before her fateful encounter with the Banaszewski family, Sylvia had inhabited no fewer than 14 different residences, a testament to the family's transient existence. The children frequently found themselves relegated to relatives' care while their parents pursued work opportunities. As Sylvia matured, she demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness, generating modest income through babysitting and providing ironing services, early indicators of her emerging independence and responsibility. The year 1965 marked a pivotal moment of transition. Lester and Betty experienced another marital separation, with Lester relocating to another state for work opportunities. Betty remained in their hometown of Lebanon with the children. Upon Lester's return, he discovered the children residing with Gertrude Banaszewski, a circumstance precipitated by Betty's concurrent imprisonment on theft charges. Confronted with the challenge of solo child rearing while maintaining employment, Lester proposed an arrangement with Gertrude Banaszewski. For a mere $20 per week, this virtual stranger would assume responsibility for Sylvia and Jenny, both of whom faced physical challenges. Lester would subsequently depart with the remaining children. The Banaszewski household represented a landscape of extreme deprivation. Their dwelling lacked fundamental amenities, no shower, no toilet, and critically, no functioning stove. Their nutritional intake primarily consisted of sandwiches crafted from stale bread and whatever edible remnants could be salvaged from garbage. The family's 7 children existed in an environment of profound neglect and persistent squalor. Remarkably, Lester exhibited a striking indifference to the living conditions awaiting his daughters. His laissez-faire attitude was encapsulated in his later courtroom statement, "I don't like to stick my nose in other people's business." This cavalier approach led him to entrust his vulnerable daughters to a woman he had known merely days, with his parting advice proving tragically prophetic: "You need to keep these girls under a firm hand because their mother let them do whatever they wanted." Gertrude Banaszewski herself presented a portrait of physical and emotional exhaustion. The Indianapolis newspaper would later describe her as a haggard, underweight asthmatic, a thin, depleted woman perpetually battling recurring depressive episodes. Her own life circumstances set the stage for the unimaginable trauma that would unfold. The convergence of familial instability, economic desperation, and individual psychological complexities created a perfect storm, a tragic narrative that would shock the nation and expose profound systemic failures in child protection. Gertrude Banaszewski's personal history was marked by a series of failed marriages, each dissolution adding layers to her profound emotional turmoil. Her family's meager financial existence relied predominantly on state child support payments, supplemented occasionally by temporary, unskilled labor. This persistent economic instability appeared to fuel her escalating animosity, with Sylvia emerging as the primary target of her accumulated frustrations. The descent into systematic abuse commenced with seemingly minor provocations. Sylvia's innocent purchase of a lollipop would trigger Gertrude's accusations of theft, a stark irony considering the family's own impoverished circumstances. Beatings were routinely justified under pretexts of uncleanliness, despite the Banaszewski household itself being a monument to neglect and squalor. Hypocritical moral condemnations became a recurring theme. Sylvia would be mercilessly punished for alleged impropriety, while Gertrude's own daughters engaged in precisely the behaviors she claimed to abhor. Paula Banaszewski was herself pregnant from a casual encounter, a fact Gertrude would dismissively deny when confronted during legal proceedings. Sylvia effectively became the Banaszewski family's collective scapegoat. Groundless accusations proliferated, including fabricated claims that Paula and Stephanie were workers. These allegations led to brutal physical reprisals, most notably from Coy Hubbard, Stephanie's former romantic partner, who reportedly used Sylvia as a human training dummy for practicing martial techniques. The possibility existed that Sylvia might have strategically leaked Paula's pregnancy secret as retaliatory action after being physically assaulted, a desperate attempt to redirect Gertrude's volatile aggression. When Sylvia attempted to reveal Paula's pregnancy, hoping to divert attention from herself, the strategy spectacularly backfired. Gertrude reflexively transformed the revelation into an opportunity to further vilify Sylvia, accusing her of sexual promiscuity. Sylvia's attempts to seek external intervention were systematically undermined. Her sister Diana Shoemaker, when approached, dismissed their accounts as mere juvenile misbehavior, remaining oblivious to the escalating horror. The abuse's progression was methodical rather than sudden. During the initial weeks of the Likens sisters' stay, interactions remained relatively benign. Sylvia participated in family activities, attending church, watching television, walking in the park, and even sharing educational spaces with Stephanie and Paula. The transformation was gradual. Verbal abuse characterized July, with physical violence emerging in August and September. Gertrude strategically weaponized community involvement, manipulating neighborhood children into participating in Sylvia's torment. She expertly manufactured narratives designed to turn potential allies into persecutors. Anna Sisko, initially Sylvia's friend, was convinced that Sylvia had slandered her mother, transforming a potential supporter into another instrument of abuse. The systemic failure extended beyond the Banaszewski household. When 12-year-old Judy Duke witnessed the abuse and reported it to her mother, she received a dismissive, rhetorically indifferent response: "Oh well, they're just punishing her, aren't they?" The Likens sisters' passive acceptance stemmed from their normalized experience of familial tension. Having grown accustomed to their parents' volatile relationship, they struggled to recognize the extraordinary nature of their current circumstances as criminal. The Vermillion family's arrival next door represented another missed intervention point. Phyllis Vermillion, seeking childcare assistance, initially viewed the Banaszewski household as a potential support network, a devastating misunderstanding that would contribute to the ongoing tragedy. Each of these elements, economic desperation, psychological manipulation, community indifference, conspired to create an environment where unspeakable abuse could not just occur, but systematically escalate without meaningful external intervention. The women gathered around the table, sipping coffee amidst the cacophony of children shouting, when Dennis, Gertrude's youngest, suddenly burst into tears. Phyllis's attention was drawn to a slender, attractive, yet visibly timid girl sporting a fresh black eye. "This is Sylvia," Gertrude remarked with a heavy sigh. Without warning, Paula Banaszewski filled a glass with scalding water and hurled its contents onto Sylvia, brazenly declaring, "I gave her that black eye." Predictably, Phyllis resolved to seek alternative childcare arrangements, though her failure to report the incident to authorities remained perplexingly unexplained. In early October, Vermillion returned for another social visit and encountered Sylvia once more. This time, a second black eye adorned her face, accompanied by a swollen lip. "I beat her," Paula stated matter-of-factly. Speculation suggested the assault followed Sylvia's revelation of some unspoken secret. Even a responsible adult seemingly failed to recognize the severity of the emerging situation, and expectations of intervention from a teenage participant were understandably minimal. Sylvia's apparent reluctance to escape could be attributed to a presumed fear that the Banaszewski's wrath would subsequently target Jenny, who suffered comparatively less severe abuse. Jenny's immobilization, her leg encased in a metal brace, further complicated any potential flight attempt. Reverend Roy Julian, the local church minister and a member of the Banaszewski congregation, visited the household in September 1965. During this encounter, Gertrude lamented her husband's child support delinquency, her health challenges, and her difficulties with the children. Her primary concern, she emphasized, centered on Sylvia, whom she accused of school truancy and prostitution. Julian, having previously observed Sylvia in church and formed a positive impression, remained skeptical. While he desired to speak with Sylvia directly, Gertrude redirected him to Jenny. By this point, Jenny had become so thoroughly intimidated that her responses to the minister were mechanical and carefully calculated. "She lies," Jenny would say, explaining that Sylvia would raid the refrigerator at night. Jenny's strategy of compliance was partly motivated by hope of avoiding personal torment. During a subsequent visit, Julian again encountered Gertrude, who now claimed Sylvia was spreading rumors about Paula's pregnancy. "But I know my daughter," she asserted, "and I know Sylvia. Paula isn't pregnant. Sylvia is." During another physical confrontation, the Banaszewskis compelled Jenny to participate in tormenting Sylvia. When Jenny initially refused, Gertrude struck her across the face. Complying thereafter, Jenny later claimed she deliberately hit her sister with her non-dominant left hand, believing this would minimize Sylvia's pain. In October, Diana Shoemaker, Sylvia and Jenny's older sister, attempted to visit. Gertrude deliberately obstructed her entry, unwilling to expose the horrific conditions. The Banaszewskis demanded and received permission from the Likens' parents to keep Diana separate from her sisters. When Diana persisted, Gertrude threatened her with arrest for trespassing. Shortly before Sylvia's death, Jenny's sole interaction with Diana was a hurried warning, "I can't talk to you, or I'll get in trouble." The abuse progressively intensified and became increasingly dehumanizing. Initially, Gertrude would whip Sylvia under fabricated pretexts, but she soon escalated to extinguishing cigarettes on her body and pouring hot water over her. The situation reached a critical point when Sylvia was beaten to extract a confession about allegedly stealing sportswear, clothing the Banaszewskis would never have purchased to enable her gymnastics participation. This experience seemingly convinced Sylvia that she somehow deserved the brutality. Subsequently, Gertrude prohibited Sylvia from attending school and confined her to the house. Apparent kidney damage caused Sylvia to wet the bed, prompting Gertrude to lock her in the basement and deny toilet access. Eventually, Sylvia was forced to consume her own bodily waste. Motivated by rumors surrounding Paula's pregnancy, Gertrude branded Sylvia's stomach with a hot needle, partially inscribing, "I'm and proud of it." Neighborhood boy Richard Hobbs, assisted by Gertrude's 10-year-old daughter Shirley, completed the branding by burning a 3 onto Sylvia's chest. Forensic evidence later confirmed multiple instances of mutilation involving a Coca-Cola bottle. The local health agency eventually received communication from Diana, who inquired about her inability to see her sister. On October 15, a public health nurse contacted the household, seeking to speak with Gertrude. With Jenny present, Gertrude menacingly whispered, "And if you say anything about Sylvia, they'll do the same thing to her that they did to her." When addressing the nurse, Gertrude claimed Sylvia was a who failed to maintain personal hygiene and had consequently been expelled. Under threat, Jenny corroborated this narrative. The nurse returned to her office and casually annotated the report as a one-time incident. Late on October 21, police arrived at Gertrude's residence, not on account of Sylvia's condition, but because neighbor Robert Pyrrhus Hanlon was reportedly attempting to break into the house, alleging theft of items from his basement. Gertrude contacted authorities, claiming Hanlon was threatening her property. The police arrested Hanlon on theft charges. He was subsequently released through a petition by Raymond and Phyllis Vermillion, who witnessed the arrest but conspicuously refrained from mentioning Sylvia's situation. Days before her death, Sylvia attempted escape upon overhearing the Banaszewskis' plan to abandon her in the forest. Captured near the front door, she was punished by being restrained in the basement and provided only crackers for sustenance. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens died from intracerebral hemorrhage, shock, and severe malnutrition. When Stephanie Banaszewski and Richard Hobbs realized Sylvia had stopped breathing, Stephanie attempted artificial respiration until acknowledging her death. She then dispatched Hobbs to a nearby payphone to contact police. Upon their arrival, Gertrude presented a letter supposedly written by Sylvia under duress, claiming she had engaged in activities with multiple boys and that they were responsible for her injuries. Before police could complete reading the document, a distressed Jenny Likens approached an officer, declaring, "Get me out of here, and I'll tell you everything." During the trial, Gertrude Banaszewski vehemently denied responsibility for Sylvia's death, pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. She claimed overwhelming exhaustion from poor health and depression had impaired her capacity to supervise the children. The young defendants' attorneys, representing Paula and Jenny Banaszewski, Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard, argued that their clients were fundamentally influenced by Gertrude. When Marie Banaszewski, Gertrude's daughter, was called as a defense witness, she initially denied her mother's involvement in Sylvia's abuse. However, she subsequently collapsed into hysterical crying, exclaiming, "Oh Lord, have mercy," and confessed to being compelled to heat the rod used by Hobbs to mutilate Sylvia's skin. She also admitted witnessing her mother's physical assaults on Likens. William Erbecker, Gertrude's attorney, attempted to mitigate the verdict by emphasizing her mental state. "I condemn her for being a murderess, but I do not hold her responsible for it because she's not all here," he stated, dramatically pointing to his head. On May 19, 1966, Gertrude Banaszewski was convicted of first-degree murder. Her initial death sentence was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment. Paula Banaszewski, whose pregnancy had been consistently denied during investigations, gave birth to a daughter. In an extraordinary gesture of maternal devotion, she named the child after her own mother, Gertrude. The infant was later adopted. Paula was found guilty of second-degree murder. After filing an appeal in 1971, she received a new trial where she pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was released 2 years later. Hobbs, Hubbard, and John Banaszewski, who was merely 13 at the time, were convicted of manslaughter, receiving sentences ranging from 2 to 21 years. Ultimately, all three served only 2 years. Gertrude herself managed to petition for release in 1985. Murder charges against Stephanie Banaszewski were dropped, as were charges against Anna Ruth Sisko, Judith Darlene Duke, Randy Gordon Leeper, and Michael John Monroe, who had also participated in Sylvia's torment under Gertrude's influence. More than half a century after Sylvia's death, the memory of this horrific crime remains palpable. Her story has been immortalized in multiple fictional works, including Jack Ketchum's novel, The Girl Next Door, and Tommy O'Haver's film An American Crime. To this day, people continue to visit the memorial at her grave, ensuring that Sylvia's tragic story is not forgotten. In the small city of Russellville, Arkansas, a tragic event shook the local community. The investigation of a 19-year-old student's murder revealed a series of shocking circumstances that had remained unsolved for years. The conclusion of this case proved so unexpected that it stunned even experienced investigators. Nona Dirksmeyer, born on December 26, 1985, grew up in a large Russellville family with 4 brothers and a sister. Her childhood was overshadowed by the loss of her father when she was 10 years old. Later, the family was devastated by Nona's confession that her father had repeatedly subjected her to abuse, a fact that remained hidden until his death and deeply shocked her mother. Despite her traumatic experience, Nona found her calling in helping other affected children through volunteer work. Her youth was filled with achievements. She participated in beauty pageants, winning several titles at the local level, was actively involved in church life, and sang in the choir. During her school years, she met Kevin, with whom she developed a long-term romantic relationship. After graduating from high school, at 19, Nona enrolled at the University of Arkansas in her hometown. Seeking independence, she rented her own apartment. Her relationship with Kevin, which had lasted 5 years by that point, underwent changes when he transferred to another university located an hour and a half away. On December 14, 2005, Kevin returned home for Christmas break. After a brief meeting with Nona, he went to his parents' house, located 16 kilometers outside the city. The next day, they each had their own plans. Nona was scheduled to take her final exams and meet with a men from her volunteer organization, while Kevin planned to accompany his mother, a librarian, to a school event. On the morning of December 15, around 9 a.m., Nona sent Kevin a message wishing him a good day. When she didn't call after her exams and stopped responding to messages, Kevin began to worry. Around 6 p.m., while accompanying his mother to the school event, he asked his friend, a pizza delivery driver, to check on Nona's apartment. The friend found Nona's car in the parking lot and lights on in the windows, but no one answered the door. Worried, Kevin arrived at the apartment complex with his mother and friend. After unsuccessful attempts to get a response, they discovered the back sliding doors unlocked, which was unusual, as Nona always installed security bars on them. Upon entering the apartment, they found traces of blood on the floor. In the bedroom, they discovered Nona's body, lying face down in a pool of blood, wearing only socks. Kevin tried to help her, but it was too late. His mother immediately called the police. Investigators arriving at the scene found a table lamp with blood traces, which was likely the murder weapon. Near the body, they found a phone with its battery removed and an empty contract on the bedside table. There were no signs of forced entry. The forensic examination determined that death occurred between 10:30 a.m. and 1 p.m. The cause of death was multiple blows to the head and stab wounds. Experts found no signs of sexual assault, which complicated understanding the motives for the crime. The investigation revealed serious deficiencies in the detectives' work. Blood samples weren't taken from the floor near the back door, fingerprints weren't collected, and the shower and second floor of the apartment weren't examined. These oversights were explained by the fact that investigators almost immediately focused on a single suspect, the victim's boyfriend. The investigators' suspicion immediately fell on Kevin due to the significant amount of the victim's blood on his clothes. When discovering the body, the young man not only tried to lift Nona but, upon realizing her death, held her body tightly against himself. Investigators interpreted this gesture not as a natural emotional reaction but as a possible deliberate attempt to get covered in the victim's blood to later explain the presence of biological traces on his clothes. Additional suspicion was raised by the fact that Kevin didn't arrive at the apartment alone but was accompanied by his mother and the previously called delivery friend. Police believed this could have been a pre-planned attempt to establish reliable witnesses for the moment of discovering the body. Kevin's behavior during the initial questioning at the apartment raised additional concerns. Sensing suspicion from investigators, he unexpectedly referenced his experience watching Law and Order, stating that he understood their attempts to make him the primary suspect. This statement seemed suspicious to law enforcement officers. A crucial aspect of the investigation was the possession of apartment keys. Only 3 people had them: Nona herself, her mother, and Kevin. Given the absence of forced entry, the theory about the use of a key by the suspect gained particular significance. During a lengthy interrogation at the police station, another detail emerged that caught investigators' attention. Around 4 p.m., after numerous failed attempts to contact Nona, Kevin sent her a message asking, "Are you alive?" Considering that the girl was already dead at this point, this message raised additional suspicions. Despite not having an attorney present, Kevin continued to answer all questions throughout the hours-long interrogation. Investigators gradually increased pressure, moving from indirect hints to direct accusations. After being left alone in the interrogation room, cameras recorded him punching the back of a chair, which was interpreted as a sign of violent tendencies. However, there was no factual evidence against Kevin. The medical examination found signs of struggle on the victim's body, which should have left characteristic scratches on the attacker's body, but no such injuries were found on Kevin. The investigation took a new turn after questioning Nona's friends. It was discovered that shortly before her death, she had secretly begun dating another man, hiding this from Kevin. Although the new acquaintance had a solid alibi, the fact of possible infidelity provided investigators with a potential motive for murder, a crime of passion after discovering the infidelity, which was also suggested by the particularly brutal nature of the injuries. Later, Kevin agreed to take a polygraph test. According to the operator, the test results showed numerous false answers. One investigator even described them as the worst in his 28-year career. However, the reliability of these results was questionable since the testing was conducted by an uncertified specialist, a regular police officer without special training. Despite the lack of direct evidence, investigators continued to apply psychological pressure on the suspect, claiming that all his close ones were already convinced of his guilt. They actively spread information about his imminent arrest among acquaintances and relatives, and even managed to convince Nona's parents of Kevin's guilt, although they initially refused to believe in his involvement in the crime. The day before the funeral, despite all suspicions and pressure from the police, Kevin actively participated in organizing the farewell ceremony at the church, joining the preparations early in the morning. Detectives called the young man in for additional questioning, assuring him he would make it to the farewell ceremony. However, the interrogation dragged on for 7 hours, causing Kevin to miss this important event. Those present at the ceremony were not informed about the reason for his absence, leading to false assumptions about his feelings of guilt. The deceased Nona's family, convinced by investigators of the young man's involvement in the crime, did not want him present at the funeral. Despite this, Kevin attended the ceremony, taking a seat far from the grieving relatives. By this time, forensic experts had completed analyzing physical evidence from the victim's apartment. When examining the table lamp, experts found Kevin's fingerprint in the victim's blood. The location of the fingerprint indicated that it could only have appeared during or after the crime. The investigation, having only this evidence, continued to develop the theory of Kevin's involvement for several months. Finding no additional evidence, on March 31, 2006, law enforcement decided to take the case to court with the available materials. The young man was arrested and charged with murder. Given the local community's bias, the defense petitioned to move the trial to another county. The lawyers feared that local jurors might render a biased verdict. The petition was granted, and the trial began in another city. The defense presented a witness who provided Kevin with a solid alibi. A plumber who was working at the defendant's parents' house that morning confirmed the young man's presence around 10:30 a.m. The prosecution insisted that the defendant had enough time to reach Nona's residence and commit the crime, as according to the medical examiner's conclusion, death occurred between 10:30 a.m. and 1 p.m. Prosecutors also noted that Kevin's phone was turned off from 10:30 a.m. to 12 p.m., coinciding with the time of murder. Mobile operator data showed that calls to the girl only began at 11:30 a.m., although in interrogations, the young man claimed he had been trying to contact her throughout the day. However, the defense provided testimony from 2 more people who refuted the possibility of Kevin committing the crime. His grandmother confirmed meeting her grandson at a gas station and giving him money for lunch. Another witness saw the defendant between 12:30 and 1 p.m. near a restaurant, which was confirmed by surveillance camera footage. The lawyers also questioned the version regarding the bloody fingerprint on the lamp. According to their arguments, if the fingerprint had appeared during the murder, the blood should have dried by the time the body was discovered. However, experts recorded that the trace was wet, supporting the version about accidental contact during the discovery of the body by Kevin along with his mother and friend. Furthermore, fingerprints not belonging to Kevin were found on the base of the table lamp used to strike the victim. Database comparisons yielded no results. The defense insisted these fingerprints belonged to the real killer. The attorneys also pointed out numerous deficiencies in police work during the initial stage of the investigation. In particular, a complete examination of the residence was not conducted, which could have led to the loss of important evidence. The medical examiner who investigated the victim's body made an unexpected statement. He determined that after death, the body had been lying on its back for some time before being turned face down. Although no direct evidence of assault was found, the expert could not completely rule out such a scenario. The defense's decisive argument came from the results of a repeated examination of the contraceptive package found near the body. While the initial examination found no fingerprints or DNA, the repeated analysis showed the presence of male DNA that did not belong to Kevin. Database comparisons yielded no matches. The trial lasted over a year, and in July 2007, the jury returned a not guilty verdict due to insufficient evidence. Nona's family, who had believed Kevin was guilty from the start, took this decision as a blow. They continued to believe that he had managed to escape punishment. Despite their client's acquittal, the defense attorneys continued working on the case, seeking to find the real perpetrator. Given the police's previous fixation on Kevin, expectations for a quality investigation were low. The defense secured DNA comparisons from the package with genetic samples from all men in Nona's circle. All voluntarily provided samples, but no matches were found. An unexpected turn came in September 2007. Gary Dunn, who had previously been convicted of assaulting a woman and lived in the same apartment complex as Nona, was arrested for robbery. Notably, at the beginning of the investigation, police had considered him a suspect but quickly shifted their attention to Kevin. The breakthrough in the case came after the defense insisted on DNA testing. The analysis results showed that the genetic material for the contraceptive package matched Gary's DNA. It's worth noting that the suspect had previously been questioned using a lie detector. Gary, who was 26 at the time, successfully passed the test, although it later emerged that the polygraph operator lacked proper certification. The most striking oversight in the investigation was the failure to verify the suspect's alibi. Gary claimed that at the time of the crime, he was shopping with his mother. Only after discovering the DNA match did investigators finally begin verifying this information. The verification revealed the alibi to be false. Indeed, Gary had gone shopping with his mother, but this occurred 48 hours before the murder. Store receipts clearly showed this date discrepancy. The suspect even provided these receipts to law enforcement, but they inexplicably ignored this critically important fact despite documenting the inconsistency in their reports. Further examination revealed that Gary's fingerprints matched traces found on the table lamp from Nona's apartment. However, a legal complication arose. Neither the DNA profile nor the fingerprint data achieved 100% matches according to court standards, although the probability that these biometric data belonged to another person was minuscule. The responsibility for this partially lies with the investigating authorities. They violated protocol by not examining all physical evidence immediately after discovering the crime. It's suspected that biological samples partially degraded during the year before they were properly analyzed. Additionally, the incomplete crime scene examination might have led to the loss of other important evidence. Based on the collected evidence, Gary was arrested and charged with Nona's murder. It emerged that at the time of the crime, he was on parole. In 2002, he had attacked a woman in a park during her jog, knocked her down and beat her while threatening to kill her. The victim managed to escape to her car. Despite quick arrest, Gary was released on parole after 19 months of imprisonment. Notably, his DNA was never entered into the relevant database. The trial began in April 2010. Among the prosecution's witnesses was the defendant's wife, who characterized him as an aggressive and dangerous person. According to her testimony, she regularly experienced physical violence and was too afraid for her life to leave her husband. Particularly significant was her revelation that a few weeks before the tragedy, she had noticed Gary watching Nona through her apartment window. The prosecution presented a theory of a premeditated attack. Given Gary's criminal history and propensity for violence, along with his proximity, he lived just meters away from the victim. Prosecutors suggested that on December 15, he executed his plan. According to their version, he gained access to Nona's apartment under a false pretense, then attacked her with the table lamp, committed sexual assault, and took her life. Due to the use of contraception, medical experts couldn't definitively confirm the assault, though circumstances pointed to it. Gary's defense denied his involvement in the crime. Lacking a credible alibi, his lawyers focused on attempting to shift blame to Kevin, proposing a jealousy-motivated murder theory. Kevin had to appear in court and listen to accusations of committing the crime. Despite the almost certain match of Gary's biometric data, the prosecution couldn't use them as evidence due to insufficient compliance with court standards. Both trials ended without verdicts due to jury deadlock. At the retrial, a key witness was Gary's 2002 attack victim, who detailed how she managed to escape from her attacker. However, even her testimony couldn't sway the jury to a unanimous decision, allowing Gary to remain free despite substantial evidence of his involvement in the murder. However, Gary's criminal behavior didn't cease. In 2018, at age 39, he committed 2 offenses in one day. First, he made an unsuccessful attempt to kidnap a woman from a church parking lot, which the victim managed to fight off. A few hours later, he committed an act of exhibitionism toward another woman in a shopping complex parking lot, leading to his arrest. The court, considering his criminal history and high probability of involvement in Nona's murder, imposed the maximum sentence, 15 years imprisonment for both incidents. Currently, Gary continues serving this sentence. Although theoretically eligible for parole, the chances of it being granted are minimal. Additionally, while prosecutors retain the option to charge him with Nona's murder for a third time, they refrain from doing so, considering the high likelihood of repeating the outcomes of previous trials. Meanwhile, Kevin, having survived this ordeal, decided to dedicate himself to a legal career. In 2011, he initiated a lawsuit against 2 Russellville police officers and Gary Dunn, accusing them of deliberately ignoring evidence and attempting to unjustly accuse him of the crime. During trial preparation, it emerged that the polygraph had actually recorded Gary's false testimony, but investigators ignored this fact. Unfortunately, the lawsuit was dismissed due to the statute of limitations. Thus, the law enforcement officers whose negligence allowed the real killer to remain free for years avoided accountability. They also escaped punishment for causing Nona's loved ones to believe Kevin was guilty of her death for so long. Only recently did her parents acknowledge their mistake and reconcile with him. Today, Kevin works as an attorney, focusing on defending the rights of individuals who have suffered from law enforcement misconduct. His personal experience has become a driving force in fighting for justice for other victims of police negligence. The dawn of February 28, 1995, brought a horrific shock to Regina Krieger's father. Upon entering his daughter's bedroom, he encountered a nightmarish scene. Instead of the expected comfort, the room was completely covered in blood. Law enforcement and forensic experts spent considerable time unable to locate the minor's body. However, when it finally reached the hands of criminology service professionals, they were stunned by the unprecedented brutality of the crime and the unbearable suffering the young girl had endured before her death. The horrific events unfolded in the city of Twin Falls, located in the state of Idaho, United States of America. At the time of the crime, the town's population was slightly less than 32,000 residents. Today, this number has doubled. Twin Falls appears to be a small, neat, and extremely attractive settlement. At first glance, it seems like an ideal place for peaceful family life and raising children. However, even in the most tranquil corners, true monsters in human form can emerge. Regina Krieger was born on March 3, 1980, to Rhonda Freeman and Daniel Krieger. The girl was always distinguished by her cheerfulness, had a wide social circle, and a younger brother named Clifton. Her passion was water skiing. She was actively involved in the local youth ski club at Lake Murtaugh. Moreover, Regina was a deeply religious girl and took an active part in the youth group of the local Lutheran church. However, with the onset of adolescence, significant transformations began to occur in her life. In 1994, Regina's parents terminated their marital relationship, which profoundly and painfully affected the child's psychological and emotional state. The situation was further complicated by the permanent disputes between the couple regarding the division of shared property. In the autumn of that same year, the girl expressed a desire to live with her father. Her mother initially resisted but eventually, being completely absorbed by property disputes, agreed to transfer her daughter to her father. From December 1994, Regina lived with her father in a relatively stable home atmosphere. Soon, striking changes began in the girl's behavior. Her habits, appearance, and social circle underwent cardinal transformations. In January 1995, she fell into a questionable company of middle school students in the city of Burley, where she was studying in the 9th grade at the time. Her parents were aware of the existing problems but could not comprehend their essence. Family relationships gradually deteriorated. Eventually, the girl independently decided to terminate communication with her negative social circle. She was provided psychological support, referred to a professional psychological consultant whose task was to help the girl overcome the consequences of her parents' divorce. A trusting relationship was established between the psychologist and Regina, which proved incredibly beneficial for the young girl. She candidly shared with the specialist her intention to leave the educational institution. She explained her decision by low academic performance and systematic truancy. This was preceded by an official written warning from the school about possible expulsion due to exceeding the permissible number of absences. However, Regina subsequently changed her mind and decided to make efforts to improve her academic performance and retain her place in school. On February 27, 1995, she again expressed a desire to discontinue her education and start working. The psychologist and school teachers, aware of the complicated adolescent period, provided her with an additional chance. The girl was offered the opportunity to attend several training sessions before the exams, which would enable her to obtain the necessary number of credits and avoid repeating the academic year. Regina agreed to use this opportunity and intended to continue her education. That day, after an intense school day, she returned home, where she lived with her father and brother on the second floor of the house. Her personal bedroom was located in the basement. That evening, the family gathered at the family table, had dinner, discussed a range of important issues, including her education, and at 11 p.m. they dispersed to their respective bedrooms. This evening would forever be the last moment when Regina Krieger was seen alive. The morning hours of February 28, 1995, began with a tragic surprise for the Krieger family. Clifton, Regina's younger brother, attempting to locate his sister, as all family members were already awake, began calling out to her loudly. Receiving no response, the teenager descended to her bedroom. The scene he encountered immediately alarmed the boy. The floor and walls were laminated with blood stains, but Regina herself was nowhere to be found. Frightened, he immediately rushed to his father, reporting the horrific discovery. Daniel Krieger immediately descended to the basement, personally confirming his son's account. The empty bedroom indeed created an oppressive impression. Blood stains covered almost the entire area of the room. Without wasting time, the man called the 911 rescue service and began making phone calls to his daughter's relatives and friends, hoping to determine her whereabouts. Initially, the father hoped that Regina, like a typical disobedient teenager, had simply run away to acquaintances. However, these assumptions instantly dissipated when all close friends categorically denied such a version. Law enforcement arrived at the scene quite quickly, but their behavior did not inspire particular confidence. The officers acted without proper interest, formally examining the premises. Extracting clothing with blood traces and a training sword for martial arts, they almost immediately put forward an initial theory. The only thing the constables noticed was the absence of signs of breaking or unauthorized entry into the house. It seemed that the girl, by their logic, could have left voluntarily, possibly staging her own kidnapping. Daniel Krieger categorically rejected such a version. Why would his daughter need to stage a theatrical performance with blood, scattering bloody stains to imitate an escape? This contradicted any logic. Eventually, after hearing the father's arguments, investigators still began a more thorough investigation. It should be noted that the technical capabilities of law enforcement at that time were extremely limited. High-precision DNA analysis techniques had not yet become widespread, and video surveillance was rare. This catastrophically narrowed the search possibilities. In the first hours of the investigation, suspicions fell on the closest circle, the father and brother of the missing girl. They were subjected to polygraph testing, which both passed without any complaints. However, the father was still not excluded from the circle of suspects, simply due to the absence of other candidates. Daniel and Clifton claimed that they had slept soundly the previous night and heard nothing suspicious. At that moment, Regina was considered missing. The bloody traces indicated serious violence and active resistance by the girl, while simultaneously being insufficient to definitively state her death. Assumptions were made about a possible escape or kidnapping. The investigation's logic was simple: an unknown perpetrator must have been familiar with Regina, otherwise, it would be impossible to explain their entry into the premises without any signs of breaking in. A key evidentiary source was the girl's personal diary. It contained detailed notes about family circumstances, parental divorce, and the associated emotional experiences. Police also discovered that Regina had a secret boyfriend named Isidro, about whom she had concealed information from her family. According to descriptions, he was a Latino teenager, a resident of Twin Falls, the grandson of a couple living near the Krieger family in Burley. It was known that he moved around in a green pickup truck and studied at the local school. Law enforcement began an active search for the young man, hoping to obtain additional information. However, all attempts proved futile. Neither the car, nor the relatives, nor Isidro himself could be found. Investigators suggested that Isidro's presence in Regina's diary might be a psychological self-defense fabrication. Against the backdrop of emotional stress caused by her parents' divorce, the girl might have created an imaginary boyfriend as a mechanism for coping with internal experiences. Consequently, this information was not given significant importance. The Krieger family was in a state of complete emotional collapse. They were stunned and bewildered, unable to imagine further steps in the search. Despite everything, each family member cherished hope until the last moment of finding Regina alive. To obtain additional information and search for witnesses, approximately 30,000 information leaflets were printed. They were distributed throughout the city, posted on streets, handed to passers-by, and placed in public spaces. On the fateful day of April 15, 1995, a female body with clear signs of significant decomposition was discovered near the Snake River Channel. The location was 15 kilometers from the missing miner's house. Forensic experts immediately determined that the body belonged to a young girl no older than 20 years. By April 17, specialists managed to complete full identification through dental records. The horrific confirmation did not take long: the body belonged to Regina Krieger. Several knife wounds were found on the body, including a critical one, a severed carotid artery. The girl's death was extremely cruel and torturous. The case was immediately reclassified from a missing person case to intentional murder. Information spread quickly through the town, causing unprecedented anxiety among local residents. Since Twin Falls was a small, compact settlement, the version of a potential serial killer instantly triggered panic moods. People began to fear leaving their own homes, carefully locking all possible locks. The father of Regina was particularly concerned, as her younger son Clifton was only 13 years old at the time. However, the increased vigilance of the population did not advance the investigation in any way. No specific testimonies or useful leads came to the police. Subsequently, detectives obtained new interesting information. It turned out that at the time of entering a questionable company, Regina had met local dealers. A man named Hubert Forras Rodriguez particularly stood out. Investigators proposed a version that the motive for murder could have been non-payment for received goods or the existence of a significant debt. At the time of the investigation, Hubert was 32 years old. Formerly unemployed, he constantly moved between Burley and Twin Falls, engaged in distributing prohibited substances. It was known that Rodriguez was part of one of the local criminal gangs. He was generally considered an extremely dangerous individual, with whom it was better not to have any dealings. It was especially risky to remain in debt to him. The substances purchased by Regina were quite expensive. It was difficult to imagine the real amount of her potential debt. We are talking about hundreds of dollars, which was an astronomical sum for a 14-year-old girl. However, at that moment, there were no direct evidence of Rodriguez's involvement in the murder. Subsequently, anonymous phone calls began to come to the police with hints of his possible involvement in the crime. But as soon as law enforcement tried to clarify details, the calls would stop. Local residents were obviously afraid of potential problems with the criminal authority. The tips did not contain any specific information, and no evidence against Rodriguez was collected. Detectives viewed him mostly as a participant in criminal schemes related to distribution. Nevertheless, the very fact of communication between a 32-year-old unemployed man and minors looked more than suspicious. Distribution of substances among such an age category was considered a serious criminal offense. Law enforcement desperately needed substantial evidence to bring formal charges. Investigators continued an in-depth study of Regina's environment, and their attention was drawn to a figure named Cody, one of the girl's friends who was also part of her questionable company and purchased substances from Gilbert Rodriguez. It turned out that on the night of the possible murder, Cody was in the company of the dealer. During interrogation, the boy provided extremely confusing testimony. He claimed to have spent the entire evening in a semi-conscious state in the bath. His account was accompanied by excessive nervousness, and his statements repeatedly changed. It seemed that the teenager was hiding something and was under significant psychological pressure. Due to the inconsistency of his story, police were extremely skeptical of his testimony. Gilbert Rodriguez remained the primary suspect in the case. In 1996, officers began active surveillance of the suspect. It was established that Rodriguez had previously been detained in 1991 and 1993 on suspicion of distributing prohibited substances. However, each time investigators failed to gather sufficient evidence for official charges. To finally stop the cunning dealer's criminal activity, the police resorted to an unconventional plan. They detained a boy named Joe, who had previously bought substances from Gilbert, and negotiated cooperation with him. The police promised to forget some episodes of his criminal past if he would purchase a batch of goods from Rodriguez, which would allow them to finally detain the dealer. Joe agreed and purchased substances worth $1,500. This enabled law enforcement to detain Rodriguez on November 18, 1996. However, the arrest was only the beginning of a complex struggle. The dealer intended to fight for his freedom by any means. Numerous criminal rumors circulated around Gilbert. Local residents had serious suspicions about his involvement in deaths. In particular, there were discussions about the mysterious circumstances of the deaths of two young people, a young man named Blake Morgan and Regina Krieger. Striking parallels were observed in these crimes. Blake was also killed at night in his own house, with attackers entering unnoticed. The only difference was that, unlike Regina, Blake was not kidnapped. On April 10, 1996, the investigation managed to identify the attackers on Blake. They turned out to be Paul, a client and friend of Gilbert, and his half-brother Jesus, who unconditionally admired his relative's criminal activities. Jesus perceived Gilbert as a role model and unconditionally followed any of his instructions. This devotion had deep roots. Rodriguez had effectively replaced his father, purposefully preparing him to participate in his own criminal schemes. Unexpectedly, drugs were not the reason for the attack on Blake. The boy did not even use prohibited substances. The true motive was hidden in personal relationships. Gilbert's girlfriend named Angela claimed that Blake had once offended and hit her. Just 2 weeks before Regina's death, a fateful incident occurred in a local bar. Gilbert, upon meeting, ordered Jesus to take revenge, to kill his girlfriend's offender. The criminals decided to act as carefully as possible. Instead of an immediate attack, they planned an assault at night, sometime between 2 and 3 o'clock, when Blake would be sleeping. For a prolonged period, the circumstances of a brutal crime remained unresolved, but gradually, the picture of tragic events became increasingly clearer. Law enforcement initially failed to identify the direct perpetrators of the crime, rendering their actions largely ineffective. The criminals first unsuccessfully attempted to enter the premises, but to no avail. However, they did not abandon their intentions. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, when the entire couple and children were sleeping soundly, the perpetrators finally entered the house by kicking in the entrance door. The direct executors of the murder were Cody and Jesus, who acted in collusion with Gil. The latter proved to be an exceptionally cautious and manipulative accomplice who observed the course of the crime but did not directly participate in the physical murder. Blake was killed instantly. A shot directly to the head made his death immediate. Gil acted so cunningly and carefully that law enforcement initially did not even consider him a suspect. His manipulative strategy was to use other perpetrators and remain unnoticed. All 3 criminals were subsequently arrested and held in custody. They were formally charged with first-degree murder of Blake. However, at that time, law enforcement did not even attempt to connect this crime with the case of the missing Regina Krieger. The position of the investigators was strange, as they, contrary to logic and available evidence, ignored the testimony of hired witnesses. Moreover, they did not believe even obvious rumors about the similarity of crimes. During this period, the dangerous dealer Huberta was in prison awaiting sentencing. The State-Controlled Substances Management was trying to identify possible witnesses. Among the inmates, Huberta was saying that he would like to know the names of these people, as he had already dealt with 2 informants. On June 26, 1997, Huberta was officially sentenced to 30 years in prison, but he unexpectedly received early release, having served only 10 years. The police somehow completely stopped investigating Regina's case. Detectives did not link her disappearance to the dealer, although all traces undoubtedly led to him. The case materials sat in the police department's archive filing cabinet for many years. An unexpected turn occurred thanks to Cody Thompson, a former associate of Rodriguez, who also had contacts with the dealer. The young man had kept silent for a long time, but ultimately the information was revealed. In 2013, a new investigator decided to reopen the investigation. Carefully studying all previous evidence, he paid attention to the bloody traces that clearly indicated the victim was dragged down the stairs and taken out to the backyard. What remained strange was why previous detectives had not noticed this. The investigator paid special attention to Cody, who by then was already serving a life sentence. Previously, his testimony had been extremely confusing. By that time, he was 31 years old, and his criminal biography included serious crimes, burglary, escapes, and murders. Almost 2 decades later, the new law enforcement officer finally connected the obvious facts. The detective was convinced of the criminal's involvement in Regina's murder, but they all confidently remained silent. A crucial breakthrough occurred after contact with Cody's former cellmate, a life-sentenced inmate who had been in prison since 2009. Having nothing to lose, he agreed to cooperate with the police. Thanks to his testimony, they were able to reconstruct the events of that tragic night when 14-year-old Regina was brutally murdered. According to the testimony, late in the evening of February 27, 1995, the girl went to sleep after 11 p.m. together with her entire family. On that fatal night, the residents of the house where Regina lived were not even suspecting the terrible tragedy that was about to happen. Sleep enveloped each inhabitant, creating an illusion of complete safety and tranquility. At the same time, Gilbert and Cody were wandering the city's night streets, making an aimless journey. Suddenly, Diller remembered an unfinished business and decided to stop near Regina's house. Gilbert carefully parked the car in a dark alley, as close as possible to the residence. Cody remained in the car, observing his partner's actions. Gilbert, using darkness and bushes as a natural camouflage, silently jumped over the fence, using the back entrance. He entered the house independently, leaving Cody waiting in the car. After some time, Gilbert returned, calling Cody out of the automobile. His face was tense and agitated. He reported that something had gone wrong and he had done something stupid, therefore requesting help. His words were filled with inner fear and panic. Soon Gilbert emerged from the house, carrying a heavy object wrapped in a bloody blanket that resembled a human body. Cody helped load the wrapped object into the trunk, not even understanding the full picture of what had occurred. During their subsequent journey, Gilbert got rid of the crime weapon, the knife, throwing it nearby. The criminals headed to a party where Rodriguez, not concealing anything, appeared with blood stains on his clothing. This fact obviously raised suspicions among other participants of the gathering, who subsequently even telephoned the police. After the party, they visited a mutual friend's house, where they changed clothes and washed away the bloody traces. Their route lay to a remote bridge located in wild territories. It was there that Gilbert, under the threat of a weapon, forced Cody to throw the body into the water. Returning home, the underage Cody was in a state of deep shock. He behaved extremely nervously, screaming in his sleep, which immediately attracted the attention of his relatives. However, the boy carefully concealed the horrible secret, fearing revenge from Gilbert, who threatened not only him but also his family. Only later at school did Cody realize that he had thrown Regina's body into the river, a girl whose disappearance was actively discussed in the area. The awareness of his own involvement in the crime caused him a panicked state. During communication with detectives, Cody confirmed information previously provided by his cellmate. As compensation for cooperation, no additional charges were brought against him in Regina Krieger's case. However, at that moment, he was already serving a life sentence. On February 20, 2019, Diller Gilbert Rodriguez was arrested on charges of murdering Regina Krieger. Despite the evidence, he stubbornly did not admit his guilt. However, new witnesses emerged who had seen him at the party in bloody clothing, along with anonymous testimonies. In October 2021, 58-year-old Gilbert Flores Rodriguez was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The 26-year wait for justice had ended. The verdict became a relief not only for the deceased's family but for the entire city. Finally, a dangerous criminal was forever deprived of the opportunity to harm society. Some people's life paths are tragic from the very beginning, depriving them of even the basic things that most take for granted. Such was the fate of Amber Gibson, a resident of South Lanarkshire, Scotland, who was born into a family dominated by violence and profound poverty. Amber's family environment was shaped by social dysfunction. Her parents, Peter and Marie Gibson, lived with their two children, older son Connor and younger daughter Amber, in a depressed working-class district. The family's financial situation was characterized by extreme hardship. Their only source of income was social welfare, as the father adamantly avoided employment, preferring alcohol instead. The dominant figure in the family was Peter Gibson, an individual with pronounced sadistic tendencies. His terroristic behavior toward family members created an atmosphere of constant fear and tension. His wife and Marie and older son Connor were subjected to particularly cruel treatment. Systematic beatings of the mother occurred in front of the children, causing deep psychological trauma. The situation reached a critical point when Marie, fearing for her life, turned to law enforcement. During the investigation, Peter continued to demonstratively threaten his wife, which became additional evidence of his aggressive nature in the court proceedings. The criminal investigation revealed shocking facts about Peter Gibson's illegal activities during 2001 to 2008. Among the crimes he was charged with was a particularly brutal attack on a young child, whom he severely injured without any rational reason. The investigation also established the fact of sexual violence against a woman whom he tied up and attempted to strangle. The victim testified that she was on the verge of death when the attacker suddenly stopped his actions. For the totality of proven crimes, including systematic domestic violence, Peter Gibson was sentenced to imprisonment. His criminal case became a stark example of how an individual with uncontrolled outbursts of aggression poses a serious threat to society. For the totality of committed crimes, the court sentenced Peter Gibson to 10 years imprisonment. The children's prolonged exposure to a toxic environment dominated by violence left a profound mark on their psyche. The older son Connor was especially affected by the destructive influence, having been the target of systematic physical and psychological abuse from his father since birth. It seemed that Peter's imprisonment in 2008 should have brought relief to the family. At that time, Connor was 5 years old, and Amber was 3. However, the situation was complicated by the fact that Anne-Marie, freed from her husband's tyranny, fell into deep depression and effectively withdrew from raising the children. Under these circumstances, social services made the decision to place the children under the guardianship of Craig and Carol Niven, a married couple. They were a childless couple who had long dreamed of parenthood and sincerely cared about the fate of the children who had endured so much suffering in their own family. The guardianship process was accompanied by opposition from the biological grandparents, who groundlessly accused the Nivens of having ulterior motives, suggesting they were only interested in receiving state benefits for the children's care. However, their objections did not affect the final custody decision. After moving to the Scottish town of Hamilton, Amber proved to be a cheerful, kind child with exceptional abilities. Despite the traumatic experiences of early childhood, she maintained a bright perception of the world, demonstrated remarkable intellectual development and artistic talent, particularly in music and singing, which delighted her foster parents. In contrast, Connor's fate took a much more dramatic turn. The violence he experienced in early childhood caused serious behavioral disorders that became apparent as early as primary school. The boys suffered from social maladjustment, exhibiting pathological withdrawal alternating with uncontrolled outbursts of aggression, primarily directed at girls. His behavioral patterns increasingly resembled those of his father. Despite his pleasant appearance, he was quite a cruel young man and wasn't ashamed to joke in his bloodthirsty manner. Connor enjoyed making jokes about death, and his cruel humor repeatedly shocked everyone around him. Because of this, classmates kept their distance from him, considering him an unpleasant and dangerous person. However, no one thought Connor was serious about killing children and animals. People around him assumed he simply had a peculiar dark sense of humor. Against this backdrop, the boy had practically no friends. This wasn't just due to his strange sense of humor and character. It turned out that he had been struggling with mental disorders for a long time, which frightened everyone. The boy was active on the internet, maintaining social media accounts where he wrote terrible things. In one of his posts during his school years, the teenager described his ailments in detail. Obviously, during that period, he was experiencing difficulties with socialization and understood what he was facing, but the illness proved stronger than Connor. He wrote that he suffered from bulimia, depression, anxiety, and attention deficit disorder. Naturally, he also had problems with academic performance. Some teachers claimed that the young man was mentally delayed and showed no interest in learning, often skipping classes. Unfortunately, no tests or analyses were conducted to confirm these suspicions. Therefore, Connor's exact diagnosis was never established. As a teenager, he was left alone to deal with both age-related and mental health problems. Connor complained that people didn't accept him, only looking at external manifestations. He didn't actually consider himself a bad person, but just wanted to cope with the consequences of his father's tyranny. The boy was convinced that his father was to blame for all these problems. Despite his desperate attempts to socialize, the young man couldn't find common ground even with his own sister, who was only a few years younger. The foster parents tried not to leave them alone together, knowing it could end in conflict and even physical fights. The children were kept separate from an early age, so their meetings and contacts would occur under adult supervision. But even under adult supervision, Connor would pick on his sister at the slightest provocation. Therefore, the foster parents sent them to different schools so they wouldn't cross paths during breaks. In high school, Connor was transferred to a specialized educational institution for teenagers suffering from social, emotional, and behavioral problems. During this period, Amber attended a regular school. As they grew older, the problems in the relationship between brother and sister only intensified. Connor, Unable to establish romantic relationships due to his uncontrolled aggression that scared away potential partners, began systematically directing his accumulated anger toward Amber. His provocative behavior and constant attacks eventually created such an unbearable atmosphere that 14-year-old Amber, fearing for her own safety, was forced to insist on being transferred to a children's home. Connor remained with his foster parents until adulthood. In 2020, seeking independence, he joined the social project Deep Triangle in Hamilton, which provided housing for the homeless, essentially moving into a homeless shelter. Although the physical distance between the siblings somewhat reduced the frequency of conflicts, their meetings continued to be accompanied by tension. However, fate dealt Amber the most tragic blow in 2021, when she became a victim of sexual assault by 20-year-old Jamie Stars. The situation was particularly cynical because the attacker, previously charged with a similar crime, had been released on bail, which allowed him to commit a new crime. For this offense, Stars received a 10-year prison sentence. The traumatic experience deeply affected Amber's psychological state. In search of emotional support, she tried to rebuild connections with all close people, including her brother, who, however, showed complete indifference to her suffering. On November 26, 2021, while still in the children's home, Amber shared with her friend plans to meet with Connor. Despite their troubled past, she nursed hope that time had changed her brother, and they would be able to establish normal sibling relationships, leaving old conflicts behind. The meeting was initiated by Connor himself through the children's home administration. Despite her friend's warnings about potential danger given her brother's previous aggressive behavior, Amber agreed to meet. Her last public sign of life was a selfie with her brother on social media, where she appeared happy. Around midnight, Connor appeared at his dormitory, attracting the attention of an office employee with his eerie appearance. He was unkempt, with hands dirty up to the wrists, and exhibited strange behavior. Ignoring the concerned employee's question about his condition, he asked permission to make a phone call, explaining he wanted to ensure his sister, with whom he had allegedly quarreled, had safely returned to the children's home. The alarming phone call revealed that Amber had not returned for the night. Further checks through the foster parents also yielded no results. It was discovered that after their initial meeting at the foster parents' house, the teenagers had gone for a walk in the park for a private conversation, after which they went their separate ways, at least according to Connor. Police, having received the missing person report, determined that the version of the girl's voluntary departure was unlikely. She had no romantic relationships, and all her personal belongings remained in the dormitory. Particular suspicion was raised by Connor's behavior, who showed unnatural indifference to his sister's fate, showed no initiative in the search efforts, and didn't even contact the foster parents regarding the situation. Investigators, beginning their inquiry, naturally focused attention on the person who had last seen Amber. During questioning, Connor confirmed the fact of an evening walk with his sister. During interrogation, Connor presented a version of events full of contradictions. According to him, after another argument, he left his sister crying in the park. His story then took an illogical turn. He claimed he got lost in the neighborhood where he grew up and fell into some ditch, which he used to explain his dirty hands upon returning to the dormitory. Investigators' suspicions intensified when Connor, while precisely pointing out on the map the meeting places and walking routes with his sister, couldn't locate the mentioned ditch. When asked about possible witnesses who could confirm his alibi, the young man gave confused answers and avoided specifics. In the absence of direct evidence of his involvement in his sister's disappearance, investigators were forced to release him. The tragic conclusion came 48 hours after Amber's disappearance. On the morning of November 28, around 10:15, 40-year-old Stephen Corrigan contacted emergency services with a shocking confession. He reported finding a girl's body in the park, confessing necrophilia with the found body, which he covered with branches after the act of violence. Police found the body 200 meters from the bridge, the last place where Amber was seen alive. The victim showed signs of brutal beating and sexual assault. Forensic examination confirmed the presence of Corrigan's DNA on various parts of the body, including intimate areas. He became the primary suspect not only in necrophilia but also in the murder. The examination ultimately confirmed that the found body belonged to 16-year-old Amber Gibson. The tragic news of Amber's death shook the local community. Connor publicly displayed his grief by posting an emotional message on social media about his beloved sister, expressing regret that the world never got to know her beautiful soul. Local residents, shocked by the brutal crime, created a spontaneous memorial in the park, bringing flowers to the site where the body was found. During this time, Connor took the initiative to give an interview to the local newspaper, wanting to tell his sister's story. However, the meeting with the journalists scheduled for December 2 never took place. By that time, Connor was already under arrest on suspicion of his sister's murder. The forensic examination revealed horrific details of the crime: 8 characteristic hemorrhages on the victim's neck indicating strangulation by hands, multiple blunt force trauma to the head resulting in intracranial hematoma, numerous fractures of facial and body bones. The nature of the injuries indicated a personal motive of the perpetrator. According to experts, the attacker first brutally beat Amber until she lost consciousness, then strangled her. The condition of the victim's clothing, particularly torn underwear, and signs of the body being dragged along the ground indicated sexual assault. A key moment in the investigation was establishing the time of death, 2 days before Stephen Corrigan's report. Corrigan's solid alibi at the time of the murder excluded his involvement in the killing itself, despite his confession to necrophilia. Investigators' suspicions about Connor's involvement were strengthened by his unnatural awareness of his sister's death. He posted about her death several hours before the official discovery of the body, which became compelling evidence of his involvement in the crime. The investigation of a missing girl took a new turn when law enforcement focused their attention on her brother Connor, who was the last person to see her alive. The girl's status as a missing person at that time prompted police to more thoroughly examine all circumstances of her disappearance. Investigators managed to reconstruct the victim's final hours thanks to the city's surveillance system. The footage recorded that at 21:51, Amber posted a selfie with her brother on social media, where she was radiating happiness. 6 minutes later, at 21:57, cameras captured them walking through the city and crossing a bridge near the park, the exact location where her body was later discovered. Approximately 90 minutes later, cameras recorded Connor returning along the same route, but without his sister's company. It's important to note that no other individuals were observed in the surveillance footage. Further monitoring of the suspect's actions led investigators to surveillance cameras near his dormitory. The footage captured Connor disposing of part of his clothing, throwing his jacket into a garbage container before entering the building, which raised serious suspicions among investigators. During the search of the containers, law enforcement officers found the jacket that the young man had been wearing on the fatal night. Notably, other elements of his attire remained untouched. According to investigators, this was explained by the simple lack of spare clothes and shoes due to the suspect's difficult financial situation. Forensic examination of the seized jacket and shoes revealed traces of soil and blood. Laboratory tests confirmed that the blood belonged to Amber, which became direct evidence of Connor's involvement in the crime. Attempts to clean the clothes of crime evidence proved insufficient, allowing forensic experts to obtain DNA samples. The forensic medical examination of the victim's body revealed blood on her underwear, which after analysis was identified as Connor's blood. Experts suggested these traces appeared due to hand injury during the victim's resistance. Additionally, the discovery of Connor's biological traces on his sister's body confirmed the fact of sexual violence, becoming irrefutable evidence of his involvement in the committed crime. While examining the suspect's mobile device, investigators discovered a strange sequence of messages. The day after the crime, around noon, Connor sent a message to a group chat of 5 participants requesting help in searching for his sister. 40 seconds later, he sent a private message to Amber inquiring about her well-being. Immediately afterward, he messaged the group again, claiming that his previous message was a failed joke and that help wasn't needed. Further analysis of browser history revealed searches about methods to avoid digital tracking and protect data from police investigation, indicating attempts to conceal traces of the crime. Examination of communications between the brother and sister revealed a horrifying backstory of their relationship. The messages revealed previous instances of sexual abuse by Connor and his threats of retaliation if his sister were to report to their foster parents or law enforcement. These circumstances had driven 14-year-old Amber to attempt leaving her foster family. Her silence was explained either by fear of her brother's threats or by complex emotional ties with him. However, shortly before the tragic event, the girl had likely decided to tell the truth to her foster parents, which could have become the motive for murder. Reconstruction of the fatal night's events showed that the meeting initially appeared peaceful. Cameras recorded their calm interaction during the walk. However, the situation changed dramatically after they entered the park. The investigation considered two versions: a spontaneous conflict provoked by Connor, or a premeditated crime where the meeting was a pretext to lure the victim to a secluded location. This meeting resulted in sexual assault and the girl's murder by strangulation. The perpetrator left his sister's body on the park's footpath, only slightly dragging it aside. On December 2, 2021, 18-year-old Connor Gibson was arrested. His detention occurred prior to a planned meeting with a journalist, where he intended to create an image of a grieving brother. He was charged with the rape and murder of his sister. Despite numerous direct pieces of evidence, including biological traces, video recordings, and digital evidence, the suspect continued to deny his involvement in the crime. However, the totality of collected evidence left no doubt about his guilt. Forensic examination revealed traces of Amber's blood on the suspect's clothes and shoes, and his genetic material was found on the victim's body and underwear. Surveillance systems recorded his presence near the crime scene, while the suspect failed to provide a convincing alibi. Investigators also examined his mobile phone's search history, where specific queries were discovered. His attempts to find information about concealing digital traces proved futile. After the young man's arrest, his foster parents revealed important details about his behavior. They had repeatedly expressed concerns about his socialization problems and the nature of his interactions with peers both at school and during his stay at the homeless shelter. Further investigation revealed disturbing aspects of Connor's personality, particularly his inclination toward destructive interests. His relationship with his sister, which appeared normal on the surface, actually concealed complex dynamics. Law enforcement included their correspondence and documentation about previous instances of sexual abuse in the case file. Investigators were particularly struck by Connor's reaction to the news of Amber's death. He displayed an unnatural indifference to the tragedy. Evidently, the suspect was convinced of the perfection of his attempts to mislead the investigation. Such behavior indicated a high level of intellectual development and possible mental disorders that distorted his perception of reality. The foster parents confirmed losing contact with Connor during the period when Amber's body had not yet been found. Despite the large-scale search operation and general community concern, he showed no interest in searching for his sister. The case shocked the public, especially after revealing the horrific details of the double violence against the victim. The realization that two dangerous criminals capable of violent acts had been present in society for an extended period caused mass shock. The prosecution built such a strong evidence base against Connor that the defense found itself in a difficult position. Lawyers unsuccessfully insisted on the absence of direct video evidence of the attack on the girl. They proposed a version suggesting that the brother was merely accompanying his sister on a walk, without criminal intentions. However, the presence of his genetic material on the victim's underwear and body remained without logical explanation. Although the crime scene was not equipped with surveillance cameras, making it impossible to record the attack itself, the totality of collected evidence convincingly established his guilt. The 13-day trial concluded with jury deliberations. The jury unanimously found Connor Gibson guilty of rape and murder of his 16-year-old sister. Considering the exceptional cruelty of the crime, the court sentenced him to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving 22 years. Next to face court was 38-year-old Stephen Corrigan, who confessed to desecrating Amber Gibson's body after discovering it on the park path. During the court hearing, the defendant couldn't provide a rational explanation for his actions, only noting his inability to suppress sexual attraction to the victim's body. The prosecution spent considerable time determining the precise formulation of charges. Eventually, Corrigan was charged with obstruction of justice. Forensic examination revealed his biological traces on 39 different areas of the deceased's body, which significantly complicated the investigation process. In defense of the accused came his father, 79-year-old retired Mr. Corrigan. He categorically denied the possibility of his son committing such a crime, insisting on his integrity. According to the father's testimony, shortly before the incident, Stephen was at the family home, displaying completely balanced behavior. Additionally, a recent hand injury from a fall, in his father's opinion, physically prevented any manipulation of the victim's body. However, the presence of numerous biological traces of Stephen on the deceased's body remained without logical explanation. Clearly, a random encounter during a walk could not have led to such intensive physical contact. Importantly, Stephen had no prior acquaintance with Amber, and his DNA was transferred to the body after death had occurred. Stephen's ex-wife provided testimony to the court about his tendency toward violent behavior. According to her, she repeatedly experienced physical violence from him and constantly feared for her life, so her former husband's involvement in the crime didn't surprise her. The defendant's lawyer attempted to offer an alternative interpretation of events to mitigate his client's guilt. According to the attorney's version, Stephen, upon discovering the body, moved it into the bushes out of concern for potential passers-by. He then immediately reported the discovery to police. The attorney characterized the necrophilia confession as a failed joke. However, this version failed to explain the presence of the defendant's biological traces all over the victim's body, including intimate areas, and the presence of semen. Such evidence clearly pointed to other motives behind the accused actions. Stephen Corrigan was found guilty and sentenced to 9 years imprisonment. The most shocking aspect of this case was the betrayal by a family member. Children who had experienced parental cruelty and maternal indifference from an early age failed to find support in each other. They spent a significant part of their childhood in the state care system, separated due to Connor's aggressive behavior. Despite warnings from friends and obvious threats from her brother, Amber never gave up hope of restoring family ties. Her final decision to give her brother a chance at reconciliation tragically turned fatal. Throughout the trial, Connor displayed complete emotional detachment, raising serious questions about his mental state. Evidently, existing mental disorders played a decisive role in committing the crime. Being older than Amber, he had spent more time under the influence of the toxic family environment and parental aggression that affected the entire family. The defense emphasized Connor's numerous attempts to seek help, evidenced by his social media posts where he openly described his problems and attempts to overcome them. However, his calls for help remained without proper attention. Amber's biological grandparents, who were previously denied custody of their grandchildren, placed indirect responsibility on the foster parents for insufficient attention to troubled children. They claimed that the motivation for adoption was exclusively state assistance, after receiving which the foster parents lost interest in parenting. The elder relatives expressed concerns about the safety of other foster children in this family. The foster parents categorically denied these accusations, insisting on their maximum efforts in supporting troubled children, although they acknowledged the complexity of this process. The decision to transfer Amber to a children's home was made for her safety, to separate her from her brother. The foster parents denied any knowledge of previous instances of violence. After reaching adulthood, Connor independently decided to move to a homeless shelter, and it was impossible to dissuade him. For a certain period, the brother and sister tried to maintain normal relations, which was encouraged by the foster parents. Unfortunately, no one could have predicted the tragic turn of events. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. Until next time, friends.